Chris is a senior lecturer in the School of Geography at Newcastle University in the UK. His research looks at how anthropogenic sediment extraction changes the shape and behaviour of large river systems. So today he's going to talk to us about how sand mining reshapes riverbeds and water flow on the Mekong River. Over to you, Chris.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, you've done my introduction there, so um, that makes the first slide a bit easier. So yeah, as Catherine said, I'm a physical geographer by background, and my research looks at how we as humans are directly altering the shape and form of sandy river systems. As a result of our kind of currently unsatiable pursuit of aggregates, and particularly sand for um, construction and other industries. And so why is sand important? Why is this an important issue, particularly in thinking about the Anthropocene? Well, sand is the second most extracted or exploited resource we have on the planet after water. It's fundamental to society as we know it, particularly through its use in cement and concrete and in construction, but also as aggregates for underpinning infrastructure, roads, and more increasingly more the kind of green transition and the infrastructure that's needed in that. But it's also used in pretty much everything, or at least a lot of things that everyone here will probably be able to see around them. Indeed, this conference couldn't happen without fiber optic cables and silica chips to power the computers and the networks that we're talking over. And so we cannot have the society that we know without sand. We extract about 50 billion tons of it a year. That's around 18 kilograms of sand per person every day on the planet. And the vast majority of that sand is used in construction, and most of that sand comes from either quaternary alluvial deposits in floodplains, or more actively, particularly in developing countries, from active sand deposits. So those in rivers, on coasts, in the marine and lacustrine environments. My research focused mainly on the Mekong, and here, just to give you an idea of the scale of this industry, this is a snapshot from a recent Bloomberg report, but is typical of scenes that you see. This is actually at the Vietnam-Cambodia border on the Mekong. And each of these vessels with cranes sticking off of them is extracting material from the riverbed and loading it onto the barges that are moored up next to them. So this is large-scale industry, large-scale human impact, but something that happens below the water. So we cannot actually physically, with our own eyes, see the impact of this, and it kind of goes under the radar a bit. So research is trying to shed light on how this scale and intensity of extraction is starting to change these systems. For a bit of geographical background, I'm sure most of you know where the Mekong is, but it flows down through Southeast Asia, flows down from the Himalaya through China, Laos, Thailand, on the border with Myanmar, and down through Cambodia and Vietnam. The image on the left shows the human interventions in this system. So the yellow and black dots show hydropower installations, scaled by the size of those hydropower plants where we've got that data. That directly stops sand from moving and sediment moving downstream, the physical barriers to the system. What we're going to focus on today is those blue dots. So the blue dots are known sediment extraction volumes, again, scaled by how much we have, the best estimates we have for how much volume of material is removed. And as you can see there, the biggest demand for sand from these river systems is coming in Cambodia and Vietnam, right at the kind of distal and down in the delta of the river system. And if we look on the right, this is a graph that shows in blue the estimates from some satellite imagery analysis of volumes removed from the Mekong in Cambodia. Year on year over those 5 years in that image from 2016 to 2020, we've got an increase in sediment extraction up to around 60 million tons a year come 2020. That's continued to increase, but has sort of plateaued just a bit higher than that in Cambodia. we see similar levels in Vietnam. So it's about 160, 120, 130 million tons a year of sand being extracted in Cambodia and Vietnam from the river system. The orange bars on that graph show the estimated bed load transport of the Mekong in Cambodia. So that's around, on average, around 6 million tons, depending on the strength of the monsoon year on year. So we're an order of magnitude greater in terms of how much sand is being removed from the river system than the river system itself is able to supply. And this has consequences. And one of those that I'm going to talk about today is how the beds of the river, the bed forms, respond to that removal. So how do we define what a bed form is? Well, on the bottom left, you can see this image of some sand dunes on an exposed sandbar in Laos. And you can see this characteristic kind of dune shape where we have a slowly rising stoss slide, a steeper lee slide as flow is moving down. So we can pull off these metrics of dunes. We can quantify their wavelength, their size, their height, and the slope of the angle. And that one's important because it affects turbulence and flow. And we're lucky that through a few projects, we've managed to get some really high resolution bathymetry data. We've got multi-beam data over the course of 10 years from 2012 to 2022 that we can use to extract these metrics. The two in bold here, September 2013 and May 2022, are the two that I'm going to focus on in the rest of the talk, just for time. So if we look at that multi-beam, this is the survey from September 2013. This is the Mekong River flow is from the top down to the bottom. And this is in Cambodia, where Phnom Penh, the capital city of Cambodia, sits just on this kind of confluence of the Tonle Sap and the diffluence of the Tonle Basap. What I hope you can see in this image is that there's these natural dune systems down the middle of the riverbed. These are sand dunes. You can see the crest lines. The blues here are deeper. The yellows and greens are shallower depths. There's a bit of confluence scour, but this is what we would expect from a natural large river system. At this point, there was limited sand extraction in this area. If we skip forward 10 years or 9 years to 2022, and look at the same stretch of the river, hopefully the main thing you can see there is, A, there's a lot more blue, so the riverbed is a lot deeper, but also those dunes have been removed. So the process of extracting of sand has removed those dunes and left this highly pockmarked area in the middle of the riverbed that is the signature of kind of the suction dredging that happens in this reach. If we take a cross section down through the middle there and look at the differences in elevations, this is just a single plot. This is probably the most exaggerated part of the system, but it's about a 12-meter difference over a 9-year period. So we see an incision of the riverbed of over a meter a year. But what we're kind of interested in is the roughness, the shape of those profiles. Got something that represents quite nice dune systems in blue, but a much more jagged, rougher system in orange there. And that's what we then wanted to quantify. And so if we pull off those metrics, wavelength, amplitude, and height, we can compare areas without sand mining to areas with sand mining. The areas in blue here on these histograms show the characteristics of those dunes, of natural dunes in blue, and of these sand mined features, these human anthropogenic bed forms in orange. And particularly in terms of their height, so how far they protrude into the water, and the angle, the steepness of those features, we get statistically significant increases in the amplitude of those features and the lee side slope of those features as a result of sand extraction. From angles of around 10 degrees to 20 degrees, amplitudes of kind of 1.8 to 2.8. So these are much rougher features impacting the flow of water. If we then quantify this, what this graph is showing on the y-axis is a roughness value. I'm not going to go into that because it's not important how it's calculated. It's a predictor of how much influence these bed forms have on the flow of water. That's a function of height and lee side angle and wavelength. But what this graph is showing is other river systems that have a series of natural dunes. And then the red bar on the far left of the screen is the anthropogenic bed forms from the Mekong. And hopefully what comes out of there is that they are significantly rougher and have significantly more impact on flow on the water and sediment movement through that river system than we see in any other alluvial system. And that's significant because this is a factor that's put into a lot of flood modeling and hydrological modeling to predict water levels. And we don't know the impacts of these actions on the resulting flood levels. Very quickly, before get to a summary, what I can do is kind of show the impact of this roughness on that flow. And so if we look at these images here, what we've got from the data from 2022, on the left, we have a series of flow. So this is flow magnitude downstream on the top, a cross stream secondary flow in the middle, and then vertical fluxes of water on the bottom for flow over natural unimpacted dunes, and then flow over impacted reaches of the bed. And again, hopefully what you can see there without going into the specifics is that the anthropogenic bed forms have a lot more blue or slower negative flow. So we're seeing the generation of turbulent flow. We're seeing the generation of recirculation zones below these anthropogenic bed forms. And we're seeing much more exchange in the vertical as a result of this upsetting of natural conditions on the riverbed. And that propagates through to sediment. So if we look at sediment fluxes, similar images, but now we're looking at the volume of sediment being moved in the flow, suspended sediment. We see that sediment detached from the riverbed where we have sand mining. So that sediment isn't interacting with the riverbed. It's not being able to be stored in those mining pits and allowing the river to recover. We're relying on diffusive sediment transport or bedload transport rather than suspended sediment transport to settle into those pits and bring the sediment back, or the riverbed back to where it should be under natural conditions. All of this has major implications for water level and for potential flood risk in these regions, particularly in monsoonal systems like this, where once a year you get major kind of increases in water level and threats to particularly non-pen in this location. So summarize this all up, and that's my 12 minutes. These man-made bed forms that we see on the Mekong are statistically different than bed forms we would expect to see in natural systems. They're have greater lee slopes and the higher amplitudes. That creates more rough bed forms and bed forms that have greater influence on flow. So we see changing flow dynamics, changing flow resistance, increases in turbulent flow generation, and all of that impacts the ability of the river to recover back to its normal state, assuming that these sand mining processes stop. But one of the remaining questions that we don't have is how long these bed forms last. Do they last for months, particularly in the dry season where there's no sediment coming down, or are they fairly temporary, or do they last over multiple flood cycles? So that's the what's next question, I guess. Thank you.